What if the Sumerian King List isn't mythology at all? What if the 241,000-year timeline is actually a map of a history we have forgotten? Beneath the sterile light of museum glass, a small clay tablet sits in silence. Its wedge-shaped marks look ordinary, just another administrative record from ancient Mesopotamia. But when scholars first deciphered it in the 19th century, they realized they were reading something impossible. It claimed that before the Great Flood, 8 kings ruled the earth for 241,000 years. Not legends passed down through generations, not poetry meant to inspire, recorded as fact. City names, dynasties, and exact lengths of reign, pressed into clay with the same careful precision used for tax records and grain inventories. The tablet does not announce its strangeness. It offers no warning, no rhetorical flourish, no acknowledgement that what it records might strain the credulity of its readers. It simply states the facts as its authors understood them, organized in columns, verified by repetition, and sealed into clay with the same bureaucratic indifference applied to cattle counts and harvest weights. This is what makes it unsettling. It is not the document of a dreamer. It is the document of an archivist. Before we go deeper into this mystery, take a moment to settle in. Let the weight of the day fall away. If you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this silence stretching across the world, connecting us all through the same ancient question. The story begins in the dust of Mesopotamia, and it has never truly ended. In the late 19th century, archaeologists descended on the plains of southern Iraq, places with names like Nippur, Kish, and Larsa. Their excavations uncovered layer upon layer of civilization, each stratum older than the last. Tablets emerged from the earth stacked like fossilized memory, thousands of them, documenting everything from temple construction to astronomical observations to the price of barley. Among these countless clay fragments, one text stood apart. It wasn't a hymn to the gods. It wasn't a merchant's ledger or a royal boast. It was something stranger, a king list, a chronological record of rulers stretching back beyond memory, organized by city and dynasty. Each reign carefully numbered. But the numbers made no sense. Before the flood, the text claimed, kingship existed in 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. 8 kings reigned across these cities, and their combined rule lasted 241,000 years. Then, in a single line of text, everything changed. Then the flood swept over. After that line, the reigns suddenly shrank. Kings ruled for decades instead of millennia. Cities rose and fell in human timescales. The text shifted from cosmic epics to recognizable history. Dynasties we can trace, battles we can date, kings whose monuments we have actually found. Scholars immediately struggled with this. History prefers gradual development, one invention building on another, cultures evolving slowly from simple to complex. But the Sumerian King List doesn't follow that rhythm. It presents history in 2 distinct eras, separated by catastrophe. Before the flood, impossibly long reigns. After the flood, normal human history. The traditional explanation dismisses the pre-flood section as pure mythology. Inflated numbers meant to establish divine legitimacy for later kings. Just ancient propaganda, nothing more. But then, something unsettling happened. Archaeologists found the flood layer. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating at Ur, one of the great cities of ancient Sumer. He and his team had dug down through successive levels of occupation, past pottery shards and mud brick walls and bronze tools, until they hit something unexpected. A band of clean, water-deposited silt, completely sterile. No human artifacts, no debris, no ash. Just pale, undisturbed clay stretching for meters in every direction. Below that layer, more human habitation. Older, preserved, and utterly different from what lay above. Woolley was not a man easily given to dramatic conclusions. He had spent years in the field. He understood stratigraphy, understood how to read the layered earth, the way a librarian reads a shelf, top to bottom, newest to oldest. What he was reading now did not fit the normal grammar of excavation. The silt was too clean, too wide, too deliberately interrupting in the way that only a truly large body of moving water could produce. He stood at the base of the trench and looked at the pale band running across the cut earth face. Around him, Iraqi workmen waited. The site was quiet except for wind and the occasional clink of a dropped tool. Woolley bent close to the silt. He ran his fingers along its surface, and then he turned to his assistant and said quietly that they had found the flood. Woolley called it the flood deposit. He believed he had found physical evidence of the great inundation described in the Sumerian texts, and, later, in the biblical account of Noah. Other scholars were skeptical, arguing it was simply a local flooding event, not a global catastrophe. The debate has never been fully resolved. But the silt layer was real. The interruption was real. Something separated the world before from the world after, and the King List had been tracking that boundary all along. What Woolley could not have fully appreciated in 1929 was how many other sites across southern Mesopotamia contained similar layers. Not identical. The depths varied. The thicknesses differed. The dates did not always align, but the pattern was consistent enough to suggest that something very large had happened in this part of the world at some point in the 4th or 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Something that left a mark in the earth visible even 4,000 years later. The King List, pressed into clay by scribes who lived perhaps 1,000 years after the event they described, treated the flood not as metaphor, but as a calendrical boundary, the moment when one kind of time ended and another began. This is not how myths usually behave. Myths absorb their subjects into symbol. The King List does not absorb the flood. It simply notes it in 8 words and moves on. But one document breaks everything the flood layer alone can explain. In 1922, a 4-sided clay prism arrived at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It had been purchased from a dealer in Baghdad by Herbert Weld-Blundell, an English collector with a taste for Mesopotamian antiquities and no particular theory about what he was acquiring. The prism was about 20 centimeters tall. Each face was covered in dense cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped impressions pressed so finely that even modern scholars admire the scribe's precision. The object is modest in scale, but extraordinary in density. Hold it in both hands, as Weld-Blundell must have done when it was unwrapped before him in Baghdad, and you hold something that was deliberately constructed to endure. A four-sided prism is not a casual format. Flat tablets were for ordinary record-keeping. Prisms were for official proclamations, royal decrees, things meant to be read from multiple angles, meant to be permanent. Whoever commissioned this object intended it to last. When translated, it revealed itself to be one of the most complete surviving versions of the Sumerian King List, now known formally as the Weld-Blundell Prism, Museum Catalog Number WB444. Scholars who examined it noted something that earlier, fragmentary versions had obscured. The pre-flood King List was not vague. It was not poetic. It was meticulous in the way that only administrative documents are meticulous, and it listed not just names and reigns, but cities, divine origins, and genealogical connections that aligned with other Sumerian texts in ways that couldn't be accidental. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, was said to have reigned for 28,800 years. The second, Alalgar, also of Eridu, for 36,000 years. The names shift with each city. The durations vary with mathematical regularity, and when scholars began examining the numbers more carefully, they noticed something anomalous. The reigns were not random. They were built from a specific unit of time called the Sar, equal to 3,600 years in Sumerian mathematics. Every pre-flood reign is a whole number multiple of this unit. Alulim's 28,800 years is exactly 8 Sars. Alalgar's 36,000 is exactly 10 Sars. The longest reign, Enmenluana of Bad Tibera, 43,200 years, is exactly 12 Sars. This is not mythology's imprecision. This is calculation. Whatever the Sumerians were encoding in these numbers, they encoded it deliberately and with mathematical care, which implies something scholars have spent decades arguing about, that the numbers are a code, not a count. The Sumerian number system was sexagesimal, base 60 rather than base 10. This was not an arbitrary choice. Base 60 is extraordinarily divisible. It can be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. For a civilization that needed to calculate astronomical cycles, ration distributions, and land measurements without a decimal point, base 60 offered a flexibility that base 10 cannot match. The Sar, 3,600 years, or 60 times 60, sits at the heart of this system. It is the unit that makes the King List's mathematics cohere, and it connects the reigns of the pre-flood kings not to human lifespans, but to something much larger. In a Berlin gallery in 1903, a researcher named Fritz Hommel had already proposed that the reigns tracked astronomical cycles, specifically the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth wobbles on its axis over a period of approximately 25,920 years, the time it takes for the equinoctial point to complete one full circuit of the zodiac. This number, or multiples of it, appears scattered through Sumerian mathematics with suspicious frequency. The Sumerians were sophisticated astronomers. Their records of planetary movements are among the oldest in human history. It would not be strange for them to embed astronomical time into their royal records. What would be strange is if they did it accidentally. Consider what it means to track precession. The equinoctial point moves so slowly that no single human life, or even a single dynasty, could observe the full cycle. To know that the cycle exists, to know its duration of nearly 26,000 years, requires either centuries of accumulated astronomical observation, passed down through careful record-keeping, or a mathematical sophistication capable of calculating from shorter observed arcs. The Sumerians appear to have had both. Their astronomical tablets include observations stretching across generations, carefully labeled with dates and scribe names, building a cumulative record that no individual could have assembled alone. But the astronomical theory doesn't fully explain why the list is structured the way it is. Why 5 cities before the flood and not 3 or 10? Why 8 kings? Why does the flood appear exactly where it does in the sequence? And why does it function as such a definitive rupture rather than one event among many? In a trench at Ur, excavated in 1929, archaeologists found another silt layer, different from Woolley's earlier discovery, older and deeper. 2 distinct flood events, preserved in separate strata, separated by centuries of human habitation. The earth, it seemed, had been interrupted more than once. The one thing water can't wash away is a record pressed into fired clay. Fired clay is one of the most durable substances human hands have ever produced. Unfired clay tablets dissolve in water, crumble in frost, disintegrate under pressure. But fire transforms clay into something closer to stone. A ceramic matrix that resists moisture, resists time, resists almost everything except deliberate destruction. The Sumerians knew this. Their most important records were fired. The King List, in its most complete surviving version, was pressed into a fired prism. Whatever the scribes who made it believed about its contents, they believed those contents were worth preserving through the most permanent technology available to them. That choice is itself a kind of argument. You do not fire clay to preserve fiction. You fire clay to preserve what you believe to be true. Eridu is where the King List begins. Alulim was its first king, its first keeper of what the Sumerians called the Me, a concept that translates imperfectly as divine decrees or the fundamental principles of civilization. The Me were not metaphors. They were enumerated, listed, stored. Among them, kingship, priestly office, scribal arts, descent into the underworld, the flood. They were thought to have existed before the physical world was fully formed, blueprints for civilization rather than products of it. And Eridu was thought to be the oldest city on Earth, the place where these principles first descended from the heavens and became manifest in clay and stone. In 1946, Iraqi archaeologists led by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd began excavating the site of ancient Eridu, a low mound in the southern Iraqi desert, 30 kilometers south of Ur. What they found confirmed the city's extreme antiquity. Beneath the ruins of later temples, they uncovered 18 successive layers of religious architecture, each one built directly atop the last, each one a little older, a little simpler, reaching down toward a founding moment that the archaeologists estimated at roughly 5,400 BCE, perhaps earlier. At the very base of this sequence of temples, In the layer designated Temple Level 18, they found a small room with an offering table and a fishbone deposit. It was the earliest known place of worship in Mesopotamia, perhaps in the world, and it had been built, rebuilt, preserved, and expanded across thousands of years of continuous occupation, each generation adding a new structure atop the bones of the last, as though every subsequent priest understood that something irreplaceable lay beneath their feet. Think about what that means in human terms. Generation after generation, sons inheriting the work of fathers, grandsons inheriting the work of grandfathers, each one building atop the previous structure, rather than clearing it away. This is not efficiency. This is devotion to continuity. The later builders did not know, could not have known in any personal sense, what lay 17 layers below their feet. But they knew that something lay there. The shape of that knowledge had been passed down through the accumulated architecture itself, each layer a word in a sentence that spanned millennia. This is what restoration means in the oldest language of record. Not to make new, but to preserve the shape of what came before. The Sumerians themselves believed Eridu predated the flood by thousands of years. They believed it was the first city established by the gods, placed at the meeting point of the freshwater ocean, the Apsu, and the emerging land. Its patron deity was Enki, god of wisdom, water, and crafts. Enki was, among many other things, the keeper of the Ma, and the deity credited with warning the last pre-flood king Ziusudra about the coming deluge. Ziusudra built a boat. He survived. He carried the seeds of everything that came after. This is the same story, in stripped-down form, as the biblical Noah, and the Akkadian Utnapishtim, and the Greek Deucalion. The flood narrative appears across cultures separated by oceans and centuries, each version slightly different, each version preserving the same core. A world ended, a single survivor chosen, a new world rebuilt from what was saved. Scholars argue whether these parallel accounts reflect a single historical event distorted through retelling, or whether they reflect something deeper, a universal human tendency to encode catastrophe in the language of divine judgment and miraculous survival. The answer may be both. And the King List, with its clean line between before and after, suggests that whoever created it believed the boundary to be literal. But the strangest evidence isn't in the list itself. It's in what the list doesn't mention. The Sumerian King List, in all its surviving versions, accounts for kingship before the flood and kingship after the flood. It does not account for the flood itself. The event appears in a single line, and then the narrative resumes, slightly different in texture, slightly shorter in its ambitions. But there is a gap in the archaeological record that corresponds to the flood's position in the King List, with uncomfortable precision. In 2006, archaeologist Harriet Crawford published a reassessment of the Ubaid period, the cultural horizon that preceded the better-known Uruk period of Mesopotamian civilization. The Ubaid lasted roughly from 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, spanning nearly 3,000 years, and represented the first widespread culture across southern Mesopotamia. Ubaid pottery, tools, and architectural styles have been found from the Persian Gulf to the Syrian plateau. evidence of either migration, trade, or cultural diffusion on a scale that shouldn't have been possible for the period. And then, around 3800 BCE, the Ubaid simply ends. It doesn't end gradually. It doesn't transition smoothly into the Uruk period that follows it. Across dozens of archaeological sites, the Ubaid horizon simply stops, and the Uruk period begins with what appears to be a new population, new pottery styles, new architectural conventions, and, crucially, the sudden emergence of writing, monumental architecture, cylinder seals, and the administrative apparatus of the world's first urban civilization. This transition, sometimes called the Uruk expansion, happened remarkably fast by archaeological standards. Within a few centuries, Mesopotamia went from scattered Ubaid villages to a networked civilization with colonies reaching as far as modern-day Turkey and Iran. Something catalyzed this transformation with unusual speed. Some scholars argue it was climate change. A prolonged dry period around 3900 BCE that would have pushed populations toward river systems and forced the development of irrigation agriculture and centralized management. Others point to population growth, to technological innovation, to the internal logic of urban development. Each explanation captures something real. None of them fully accounts for the speed, the scale, and the apparent discontinuity. In 1906, a German expedition excavating at Uruk, the city that gave the period its name, uncovered something that forced a rethinking of this narrative. Beneath the oldest known temple complex at Uruk, they found evidence of a still earlier occupation layer that predated the Uruk period proper. Something had been there before. Something was buried beneath the founding moment of civilization. The King List, of course, says exactly this. Before the great cities, there were earlier cities. Before the dynasties we know, there were dynasties we've forgotten. The text doesn't claim this as myth. It claims it as record. And yet the archaeological evidence remains ambiguous, because ambiguity is what the earth preserves when something is truly old. What was buried is not always what was lost. The pre-flood kings in the Sumerian King List are not ordinary rulers. Several of them are explicitly described as having descended from heaven, as being, in some sense, divine or semi-divine. And throughout Sumerian literature, these antediluvian figures are associated with the Anunnaki, a class of beings whose name translates in the most literal reading as those of royal blood, or princely offspring of heaven and earth. The Anunnaki appear across the full breadth of Sumerian and Akkadian religious literature. They are judges, record-keepers, administrators of fate. They sit in council and deliberate over human destiny. They descend to earth for purposes that are sometimes benevolent, sometimes indifferent, and occasionally catastrophic. In the flood narrative preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works of literature in the world, it is the Anunnaki who are present when the decision to destroy humanity is made, and it is one of their number, Ea, the Akkadian form of Enki, who warns the flood hero in secret. The Anunnaki are described in ways that are unusual for mythological figures. They are numbered. They are ranked. They are assigned specific administrative responsibilities, overseeing particular cities, managing specific aspects of the divine order, in the way that a bureaucratic system assigns portfolios to officials. The great Anunnaki of heaven, number 7. The great Anunnaki of the earth, number 7. The lesser Anunnaki number 300. These figures recur across texts separated by centuries and thousands of kilometers of manuscript transmission, with a consistency that suggests the Sumerians were not inventing freely, but preserving something specific. What they were preserving is the deeper question. Some scholars have proposed that the Anunnaki represent a memory of a real ruling class, perhaps a priestly elite, or a foreign dynasty that exercised power over early Mesopotamian communities before the historical period begins. Under this interpretation, the exaggerated reigns of the pre-flood kings encode the lifespans or dynastic tenure of a class of rulers whose actual characteristics have been mythologized through generations of oral transmission. The divine becomes the distant, becomes the impossible. A king who ruled for a century becomes a king who ruled for 28,800 years. This interpretation is speculative. It cannot be proven from the surviving evidence, but it explains something that the pure mythology theory does not. Why the King List is structured so precisely, why the numbers are so mathematically regular, and why the post-flood portion of the same text aligns so well with verifiable history. Because the scribes who composed the King List were not fantasists. They were archivists. They preserved what was given to them with the same care they applied to grain tallies and temple inventories. Something was given to them. The question is what? The Epic of Gilgamesh is, by any measure, one of the greatest literary works ever produced. Composed in Akkadian from Sumerian originals, it tells the story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, a figure who appears in the Sumerian King List as the 5th king of the first post-flood dynasty of Uruk, credited with a reign of 126 years. The epic names him as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, a king of superhuman strength and ambition, a man who builds walls, conquers monsters, befriends a wild man named Enkidu, and, after Enkidu's death, sets out on a desperate journey to find the secret of eternal life. He fails. He returns to Uruk without immortality. He has to accept the fact of his own death. This is the oldest surviving story in the world about a man confronting his own mortality, and it is wrapped around a figure who actually existed. A real king of Uruk, ruling perhaps around 2700 BCE, who built or expanded the city's famous walls, and left such an impression on Sumerian memory that he became legend within generations of his death. In 1853, excavations at the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, modern-day Mosul, Iraq, uncovered thousands of cuneiform tablets that had survived the destruction of the library, though broken and scattered across the mound. Among them were 12 tablets containing the standard Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Tablet 11 contained the flood narrative, nearly identical in its structure to the later biblical account. The discovery caused a sensation when it was translated and presented to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in 1872. For the first time, the scholars had evidence that the Noah story predated its biblical form by at least 1,000 years. The tablets were fragmentary. George Smith, the young Assyriologist who first identified the flood narrative in the Nineveh collection, reportedly exclaimed aloud in the reading room, and then left the building to walk around the block. He had just read something that restructured the known history of religious narrative. The quiet of the British Museum archive was not adequate to contain that realization. He needed the street. But what interests us now is not the flood narrative. It is the moment in the epic when Gilgamesh crosses the waters of death to reach Utnapishtim, the Babylonian flood survivor, and asks him for the secret of immortality. Utnapishtim was the last pre-flood king. He was granted eternal life as a reward for surviving the inundation and preserving humanity. He now lives, with his wife, at the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the world, beyond the reach of ordinary time. Gilgamesh reaches him. They speak. Utnapishtim does not give Gilgamesh immortality, but he hints at a plant at the bottom of the sea that can restore youth. Gilgamesh dives for it. He retrieves it. And then, on the journey home, a serpent steals it while he sleeps. Scholars interpret the serpent as a symbol of the natural world's indifference to human longing, or as a reference to the snake's ability to shed its skin and appear reborn. In Mesopotamian cosmology, snakes were associated with the freshwater underground, the same domain ruled by Enki, keeper of wisdom and the pre-flood knowledge. But the deeper pattern here is the one the King List was also encoding. Before the flood, lives stretched across millennia. After the flood, they contracted to something human and finite. Gilgamesh is the first fully human king in the post-flood tradition, the first figure who must reckon with death rather than outlast it. His failure to find immortality is not a personal failure. It is the founding condition of the post-flood world, and the pre-flood kings, preserved in their perfect mathematical reigns on the clay prism in Oxford, are what he was searching for. Memory buried, restored only in fragments. In the 3rd century BCE, a Babylonian priest named Berosus wrote a history of Mesopotamia in Greek, intended for the Hellenistic audience that had come to rule the Near East after Alexander's conquests. The work, titled Babyloniaca, has not survived intact. We know it only through fragments preserved by later Greek and Roman writers, Josephus, Eusebius, Syncellus, who quoted it when it suited their purposes and ignored it when it didn't. Berosus was not a naive man. He was a priest of Bel-Marduk in Babylon, which meant he had access to the temple archives, the accumulated records of centuries of Babylonian scholarship. He was translating, in the most literal sense, one tradition into the vocabulary of another, trying to make the world's oldest civilization intelligible to the civilization that had just conquered it. His work was a diplomatic act as much as a historical one. What Berosus preserved was, among other things, a king list remarkably similar to the Sumerian one. 10 kings before the flood. Reigns measured in sars and nirs, the same Sumerian units. A flood, a survivor, a new world. The numbers in Berosus are different in their specifics, but identical in their structure. Inflated pre-flood reigns, divided from normal history by a catastrophe. Scholars have long noted the parallel between Berossus's 10 pre-flood kings and the 10 pre-flood patriarchs of the Hebrew Bible: Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. The biblical figures also have anomalously long lifespans. Methuselah's 969 years is the longest. Enoch is taken directly by God without dying. Noah, at 600 years old at the time of the flood, builds the ark and survives. The structural parallel is too precise to be coincidental. Both traditions count exactly 10 antediluvian generations. Both end with a flood. Both describe a survivor who preserves humanity's continuity. The specific numbers differ. The architecture is the same, which implies that both traditions drew on the same source, an older, shared memory of the pre-flood world encoded in two different cultural languages. In a Copenhagen archive in the 1970s, a researcher examining the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, made in Alexandria around 200 BCE, noticed something anomalous. The lifespans of the pre-flood patriarchs in the Septuagint are consistently longer than in the Hebrew Masoretic text used by most modern Bibles. In the Septuagint, some patriarchs live even longer, with small but systematic differences that suggest the numbers were adjusted at some point in the transmission, or that different versions of the underlying tradition were preserved. The text was copied and recopied across cultures and centuries. Each copying was an act of restoration, an attempt to preserve something that the copier believed to be true, or at least important. The number drifted. The structure held, because structure is what survives when the specific details are lost, and the structure says something came before, something was interrupted. What came after was different in kind, not just in scale, but in its fundamental nature. But one document, discovered in a trench at Nippur in 1893, breaks the argument in a direction no one expected. The tablet is fragmentary. Large sections have been lost to the erosion of time. The clay cracked and dissolved in the upper layers of the Nippur mound, leaving only about a third of the original text legible. What remains, however, is astonishing. It is one of the oldest known creation and flood narratives in the world. Scholars call it the Eridu Genesis. The text opens with the creation of animals and humans. It describes the founding of cities and the establishment of kingship. It names the antediluvian cities, some of the same cities listed in the King List. And then it describes the flood in terms that precede the later Babylonian and biblical accounts by centuries. The flood hero here is Ziusudra, the same figure named as the last pre-flood king in some versions of the King List. Ziusudra is warned by the god Enki. He builds a large boat. The flood comes, described as a storm, lasting 7 days and nights, the most severe in history. When it recedes, Ziusudra opens a window. Light falls in. He bows before the sun god Utu. He sacrifices animals in gratitude. And then, in the damaged final section, he appears to be granted immortality and transported to the land of Dilmun, a paradisiacal realm associated in Sumerian geography with the Persian Gulf region. Dilmun appears repeatedly in Sumerian literature as a place of origins, a land before corruption, before death, before the difficult conditions of ordinary human life. Some scholars identify it with Bahrain, where archaeological evidence suggests an unusually prosperous and long-lived Bronze Age culture. Others place it further east, in the direction of the Indus Valley. A few have suggested it is purely mythological, a literary Eden, not a physical location, but the Sumerians treated it as real. They sent trading expeditions to Dilmun. They received copper and other goods in return. It was a trading partner, not a metaphor. And yet it was also the place where the flood survivor lived, eternally preserved, at the edge of the known world. This is the same paradox the King List encodes. The pre-flood world was real enough to record in administrative detail. The individual kings had names, cities, succession orders, and yet it existed in a kind of time that is no longer accessible. A time when the boundaries between human and divine were not yet fixed, when lifespans were measured in millennia, when cities could endure for tens of thousands of years without falling. The flood is the boundary. On one side, the anomalous. On the other, the historical. The Eridu Genesis places the flood hero in Dilmun after the flood, preserved, immortal, remembered. The King List places him at the end of an era, the last record before everything changed. The Epic of Gilgamesh places him beyond the waters of death, unreachable, carrying knowledge that can no longer be transmitted. 3 texts, 3 versions of the same boundary. Something real was on the other side of it, something that left fingerprints in clay. Return to the numbers. They are the most persistent anomaly in the King List, and they have been the subject of more scholarly analysis than any other element of the text. The standard explanation, as we have noted, is mythological inflation, the practice of attributing impossibly long reigns to pre-flood rulers to convey their nearness to the divine. This is attested in other ancient cultures. The Egyptian King List in the Turin Papyrus includes a section of divine and semi-divine predecessors before the historical pharaohs, with similarly extraordinary durations. Manetho, the Egyptian priest who compiled a history of Egypt in the 3rd century BCE, included reigns of tens of thousands of years for the earliest divine rulers. The pattern is not unique to Mesopotamia, but the mathematical precision of the Sumerian numbers is. Every pre-flood reign is divisible by 3,600, the Sumerian Sar, not approximately, exactly. The reigns are 28,800, 36,000, 43,200, 28,800, 36,000, 21,600, 21,600, 18,600. These numbers, when divided by 3,600, give 8, 10, 12, 8, 10, 6, 6, and 5.166. Only the last reign, Ubartutu of Shurupak, father of Ziusudra, breaks the pattern with a non-divisible number. Some scholars believe this is a scribal error. Others think it is intentional, signaling the approach of the flood as a disruption in the mathematical order. The total, 241,000 years, is itself a significant number. It is equal to 67 SARs, or, expressed differently, it is approximately 9.3 times the precession cycle of 25,920 years. The closeness to astronomical values has led some researchers to propose that the King List is secretly a precessional calendar. a record of time measured in units of the great cosmic cycles rather than ordinary years. In a 1998 paper published in the journal Discussions in Egyptology, mathematician Rolf Krauss analyzed the pre-flood rains and proposed that they encoded a Sothic calendar system, a method of timekeeping based on the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, used in ancient Egypt and possibly shared with Mesopotamia through trade connections. Under this interpretation, the rains represent astronomical periods, not human lifespans. Other researchers have proposed Vedic parallels. The Hindu concept of the Yuga, vast cosmological ages measured in thousands of years, shares structural similarities with the Sumerian pre-flood chronology. Both systems describe time as a sequence of increasingly degraded ages, moving from a golden era of great lifespans and divine proximity toward a degenerate present. The Kali Yuga of Hindu cosmology, in which we currently live, is described as an age of diminishment. Shorter lives, weakened minds, crumbling institutions. The Sumerian King List ends with the flood as its Kali Yuga moment, the boundary between the great time and the small time. Whether this parallel reflects a shared source, a convergent human tendency to encode cosmological pessimism in genealogical form, or simply coincidence, scholars argue. The evidence is preserved. The interpretation remains open. But the numbers are not random. They were not chosen arbitrarily. Whoever composed the King List knew what they were doing with these figures, and they did it with a care that has outlasted their civilization, their language, and their gods. The fingerprints are in the clay. We are still learning to read them. Consider the scribes. They are the invisible figures behind all of this, the men and women, and in Mesopotamia there were women scribes, who sat with their reed styluses and pressed mark after mark into damp clay, encoding knowledge they may or may not have fully understood into a medium they knew would outlast them. Scribal training in ancient Sumer was rigorous and long. A student scribe, called a son of the Eduba, a son of the tablet house, spent years copying standard texts, mastering the hundreds of signs that made up the cuneiform writing system, learning the technical vocabulary of law, accounting, astronomy, medicine, and literature. By the time a trained scribe was entrusted with a document of importance, he was not merely a copyist. He was a custodian. He understood, at least in part, the weight of what he was preserving. When the scribe who produced the Weld-Blundell Prism pressed those final wedge marks into the wet clay, the marks that would sit undisturbed in the earth of Mesopotamia for 4,000 years, before a Baghdad dealer sold them to an English collector who sent them to Oxford, he was not creating something new. He was copying something old. How old is uncertain. The text he was reproducing may itself have been a copy of an older text, which was a copy of something older still, reaching back through chains of scribal transmission toward an origin that even its earliest copyists may not have known. This is how knowledge survives catastrophe, not in one great archive, preserved intact, but in fragments, copies, partial versions, parallel traditions, each one slightly different, each one preserving some element that the others lost, each one making sense only when read alongside the others. The King List, the Eridu Genesis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Babyloniaca of Berossus, the Book of Genesis. These are not competing accounts. They are facets of the same object, each one reflecting a different angle of a light source that no longer exists. And somewhere in the geometry of their differences, in the places where they agree despite everything that separates them, is the shape of whatever actually happened. What would it mean if the King List is not mythology? What would it mean if it is, as its authors insisted, a record? It would mean that before the flood, whatever the flood was, whenever it happened, whatever its scale, there was a civilization. Not the civilization we know. Not the one that emerged in the Uruk period with its writing and its cities and its legal codes. Something older. Something that existed in a kind of time. The King List calls the era of the Sars, the great cycles, the astronomical ages, the epochs that dwarfed anything human memory could contain. It would mean that Eridu was genuinely the first city, not just the first city in the post-flood world, but the first city in any world. That its 18 layers of successive temples are not the oldest layers, but only the oldest that survived the water and the time and the earth, pressing down on everything below. It would mean that the Anunnaki, whatever they were not invented. They were remembered, distorted by transmission, elevated by reverence, encoded into the language of divinity, because no other language was adequate to describe something so far beyond the reach of ordinary experience. A dynasty so old it could no longer be spoken of as human. A class of knowledge keepers so ancient that the only way to preserve their memory was to make them gods. It would mean that Ziusudra, or Utnapishtim, or Noah, or Deucalion, was not a mythological figure. He was the last person who stood between the world before and the world after, the last human being who had direct access to the knowledge of the pre-flood epoch. And when the flood came and receded, and he stepped out of his boat into the changed world, the chain of direct transmission broke. What remained was what had been recorded, what had been pressed into clay, what had been fired and buried and preserved by the indifferent weight of the earth for thousands of years, waiting for someone to dig it up and hold it under museum glass and realize they were reading something impossible. This is what the King List encodes, not the names of gods, the memory of a before. Somewhere in a climate-controlled archive in Oxford, the Weld-Blundell Prism sits in the dark. Museum Catalogue number WB444. 4 sides of carefully impressed cuneiform, each column a record of kings and cities and durations that no living civilization can verify. It has been there for over 100 years since Weld-Blundell purchased it in Baghdad. Before that, it sat in the earth for nearly 4,000 years, buried beneath layers of sand and occupation debris, pressed down by the weight of everything that came after it. It survived. It was restored from the ground. It was deciphered, translated, debated, and preserved behind glass where the light falls on it, in the slow rotation of display case illumination. What it says, what it has always said, from the moment the unnamed Babylonian scribe pressed those final wedge marks into wet clay, is this: there was a before. It was different from the after. Something separated them. and we kept the record. This is what the King List is, a record kept at the boundary between two worlds. Not mythology, not propaganda, not priestly fiction. A record, pressed into clay with tax collector precision by a civilization that understood, more clearly than we sometimes credit, the difference between what it knew and what it was preserving. The pre-flood kings may have been mythological. Their reigns may encode astronomical cycles or cosmological schemes we have yet to fully decode. The flood may have been local, regional, or genuinely catastrophic on a global scale. The Anunnaki may have been gods, or priests, or literary constructs, or something else entirely. Something that the Sumerian language was equipped to describe, and our modern languages are not. We do not know. We may never know. The evidence is fragmentary, the translations contested, the archaeology incomplete. Every year, new tablets emerge from the earth, new sites are excavated, new interpretations are proposed. The field is not settled. It is alive, argumentative, and perpetually surprised. But consider this. The civilization that produced the King List also produced the world's first writing system, the world's first urban centers, the world's first legal codes, the world's first literary epic. They were, by any measure, among the most sophisticated people who have ever lived. They were not naive about the difference between history and legend. They had bureaucrats and lawyers, and astronomers and engineers, and they wrote down, in the most official format available to them, a multi-sided administrative prism, the format used for royal proclamations, that 8 kings ruled the earth for 241,000 years before the flood. They believed it, or they preserved it, as if they believed it, which amounts to the same thing. The epoch before the flood is not recoverable in any ordinary sense. The silt that buried it is too deep, the years too many, the evidence too scattered across too many disciplines that rarely speak to each other. But the map exists. It is 4-sided, made of clay, covered in fingerprints pressed 4,000 years ago. It is waiting, as all preserved things wait, for the question that will finally unlock it. And in the meantime, the silence before sleep is the closest thing we have to the kind of time the King List describes. A slow, deep duration, measured not in minutes, but in the quality of stillness. The world goes quiet. The archive closes. And somewhere in that darkness, the 8 kings wait, counting their stars, watching the flood gather on the horizon. They have been waiting a very long time,